day 2 of the CAG meeting. We have a great agenda for day 2. We're gonna kick it off with less complex entities. We're going to move to fraud and going concern. And I'd like to point out these are both potential standards that are in their very early phases. And so it's very important to get feedback from the CAG. I thought we had some great feedback yesterday. And I think these will be 2 topics that will engender even more feedback. Then we'll have a break at about 8:50. And that will be followed up by the work plan, and then there will be a private and closed session. So in the private session, we will move some people in and out of the room, and it will be how we conclude. So I'd like to kick this off by first talking about LCEs, less complex entities. And Roger, you're going to present for the task force. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, and good evening from Australia, good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are. If we can go to the first slide, please, Karen. Okay, you will see from this first slide that we'll go to the second slide. The developments since March, you will see that there are 2 chairs, co-chairs of working groups working in this particular project, and we'll explain to you how we've got there. The last time we spoke to you was in March 2020, so since that time we've had 2 discussions with the IAASB with regards less complex entities. So in April 2020, soon after the CAG meeting, the working group presented to the board the further work that we've been undertaking, which we ran past the CAG on the way forward for IAASB action. Then in June 2020, we presented the IAASB proposals for developing a separate standard for audits of LCEs, using the overarching principles that would guide the development of that standard. And Kai, who is the co-chair of that particular group, will talk to that a little bit later. We have made certain changes to our planned board meetings due to the restrictions on travel and the restrictions on work effort. And only the work stream related to the development of the separate standard was discussed. So the same will happen in December when we're going virtual. So CUSP will come to the board for discussion in June 21, but not before that particular impact. So let me go down to on this one key topic. So reducing the complexity on ICAs. So it has been on the agenda for a while, and it is a key topic for the IAASB moving forward. We have heard a couple of key messages. The need for a global solution. We don't want this to become fractured across the different jurisdictions. So there are many jurisdictional developments, and that's not in the public interest where we get a range of solutions happening out there. We have heard the message very strongly about the need to keep standards fit for purpose. So this is the suite of ICEs, and we need to keep the standards fit for purpose, and the need to move quickly in this particular area. We are very mindful of the risks, and we also need to make sure that they are due processes. These are consistent messages that we've got not only through the discussion paper, but also through the outreach. Next slide, please. So our approach to addressing the challenges, you can see the timeline that is there. In the discussion paper, we asked for views on the alternatives. And on balance, the respondents came back and said that they would prefer that we address the issues in the ICEs as they relate to all audits. But they also recognised there was a need for a solution more quickly, and therefore we're open to the development of a separate standard for LCEs. Therefore, we have developed a 2 workstream approach to address both the issues relating to complexity and some of the other issues, understandability within the suite of the ICEs, as well as the development of the standard. So we have a broader approach to the way that we will go about drafting the ICEs. So we're looking at drafting principles to address the complexity, understandability, scalability, and proportionality, now named as CUSP. And thank you, Lily, for giving us that particular acronym to go forward on. We also have the separate standard, currently developing the fundamental principles. And we have heard strongly about the fact that the documentation is a concern, and both streams will focus on documentation. Both streams are equally important to the IAASB, and both streams are expected to inform each other. We do have joint people who are members of both working parties and staff across each of those particular areas. Discussions with the board on the CUSP are planned for January 2021, where the proposals for drafting principles and guidance will be discussed. And we're working at presenting a separate project in the LCE working group in December 2020, and Kai will talk to that a little bit later. Next slide, please. So let me talk about the CUSP workstream very quickly, complexity, understandability. So let me move to the next slide. Okay, it is a focused working group. So following the June 2020, we have set up that working group and we'll focus on information gathering activities related to that work stream. Initially developing principles and guidelines, drafting principles and guidelines to enable the writing of standards that will result in a consistent and effective application. So we're looking firstly at how the Clarity conventions, which were developed during the Clarity project, are currently being applied. And we're considering any new principles using those used in drafting standards, such as the recent ISA 315. The intention is to develop drafting principles and guidelines. We will then consult on those and then we'll use those for drafting the ICEs as we move forward. So proposed timeline, as you can see there, we're following the arrows through. July 2021, we'll consider the various sources and we'll develop the drafting principles and guidelines. In August 2020, I should say, January 2021, the first discussion with the board, as I've mentioned, on those drafting principles and guidelines. In June, we'll get agreement from the board to consult on the drafting principles and guidelines, and we will go out to the market and we'll analyse the feedback from the consultation Q4 2021, Q1, 2 and 2 2022, and we will determine the way forward Q 2022. We will explore and determine the actions, and during the way we will consider whether there is some non-authoritative guidance and materials such as staff alerts, Q&As, for which we can address those particular issues. Next slide, please. So slide 7, this basically shows what the areas that we will work through. We've had our first meeting in August 2020, and we've discussed an approach to developing the drafting principles and guidelines, which broadly consist of the following. So at the moment, we're compiling or documenting the Clarity drafting conventions. They are spread through our standards a little bit, and so we're doing this in an organised and comprehensive manner and agreeing what should be included in the drafting principles and guidelines. There are some areas that we may need to consider further where there have been changes in practice from where the Clarity conventions were agreed on, such as the use of introductory paragraphs and the style that we see in the introductory paragraphs in each of the ICEs we will look at. We have considered the new drafting principles for enhanced presentation that has been used in the recent revised ICEs, and certainly the stringency of the drafting approach which was used in ISA 315, which was revised in 2019. And we'll discuss how they should be included into the drafting principles and guidelines, and therefore look at how they should be applied toward the suite of ICEs. There is some that brought a rigor that we all agree on, And there are some of those approaches that we just need to do a little bit more work on. We are considering other matters about drafting, such as how we go about using very clear, plain language, avoiding duplication as we're looking at each of these ICEs in isolation and putting them together. We are learning about the duplication and the repetition and areas of cross-referencing as we go forward. So as we've noted, we will focus separately on documentation, as we've continually heard that it is a pain point. And so we will work out how we do that in accordance with our documentation standard and the documentation areas in each of the standards. This gives rise to our question, which is on the next slide. Chair, we're asking the CAG representatives for their views on the proposed approach as I have just outlined for the CUSP workstream. Both work streams equally very important to the IAASB. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. And some very important questions for, very important question for the group. And so I wanted to see if we have any response from CAG members. I do have a hand up, Paul Thompson.
Thanks, James. Thanks also for the presentation, for the update. I guess not surprisingly, Aoife, our main concern is the scalable is access to a standard that supports a scalable audit of small and mid-sized businesses. So we are highly supportive of the direction that the board has taken, and we're also, I know it's not directly in relation to question one, but we also appreciate the initial focus being on the development of the separate standalone standard. That's all from my side.
Thank you, Paul. Galen?
Yes, thank you for your introduction here, Roger. I do have a question, and maybe it's a tag on to what Paul was sort of introduced as well, and that is the proportionality and scalability. I'm not sure what the distinction is between the two. I do think it probably should be addressed in order to avoid duplication. But I remember when I first came on the CAG about a decade ago, it was usually talked about in terms of proportionality. And then I thought that scalability replaced that concept as we went along. So, you know, maybe if you, in the CUSP, framework, what are we talking about in terms of the difference there? If possible, you could shed some light on that.
Thank you, Galen. Conchita.
Thank you. Actually, I would consider the development of a separate standard for less complex entities to be a very important undertaking, and I support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Conchita. We have a few more hands. Hyson? We'll give it a second for Hyson to come in.
Yes, can I speak now? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. It seems that these two work streams are going to be developed in a parallel way. What means that even ISAs will be much more scalable, and you know, this kind of work will help also the other project. Although we are in favor of the project for the audit, the standalone standards on auditing SMEs or less complex entities, but even these two, let's say, work streams works well. That means that they could interact with each other, and will prepare a good basis. And the scalability and the understandability or the CUSP issues that are included will help in proper application of ISAs, even in case they are not in relation with the SMEs, but with the other entities.
Thank you, Haitham.
Okay.
Takashi.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Roger, for the explanation for the CUSP workstream 1. I have one just observation, same as Galen. I am not sure at this moment. I'm not sure the differences between the CUSP project and the separate standard for LCE, especially that I'm not sure the outcome of the CUSP project. After addressing the issue of the understandability or scalability, such as that IAASB revised or modified the current ISA. Such kind after the revised ISA is available for the auditing for the LCE or and such kind of the question comes in my mind. So I'm not sure that the difference between the outcome of the two work stream. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, we have a number of hands up. Roger, do you want me to continue on, or do you?
We might continue on. We're getting a common theme. So Chair James, we'll take, if you're happy to continue on, then I'll try and wrap up with a few responses at the end.
That's fine. Megan Zeitsman.
Great, thank you, and hello everybody, and thanks Roger for the presentation. So I think this work is important. So I think the work of the both work streams, and in particular this one on the first work stream, I think as others have said, this is the one that will actually impact all the ISAs. So it's not specific to the issues of audits of less complex entities. So, but I do think it's an important initiative. When you think back to the Clarity project that took place so many years ago, probably some of the conventions that were used at that time have probably not been used as consistently as in later ISAs. And there's certainly probably some more complexity that has been introduced into some of the later standards, notwithstanding the efforts in some of the recent projects like 315 to try to use some conventions to simplify them. I think my question is really around, I guess, a phase that will still come, which is the phase around once you've decided and settled on the principles, the issue of then going back and looking at the old ISAs and updating them or refreshing them to incorporate those principles, because that just feels to me, maybe that's the Clarity Project version 2. And I think the real risk is that as you open things up to simplify or streamline, you land up with big debates about what those paragraphs actually mean, and you land up with unintended changes in the standards, and so that could be a very, very significant undertaking. And I recognize that's still to come down the road, but it's probably something to to have a strategy around what really that will be, and what will be the guardrails to not change something that really doesn't need to be changed. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Rob DiTrulio.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess my first of all, Roger, thank you for the presentation. And I guess my comment would be similar to Megan's. We had the consultation paper about a year or so ago with the different options, and I guess the most correct me if I'm wrong, but the most popular response was separate standard, rather than going back and doing the revision. So, similar concern that going back and revising some of the existing standards, that we have that unintended consequence. I think, the idea of having separate standards for less complex entities, I think is a great one. We've done it on the accounting side, domestically, but I just concerned about going back sort of retroactively, particularly some of the more issued standards like 540 and 315 that we work hard to sort of get right.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, we have Paul Munter.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, Roger. Thank you for the presentation. First of all, I don't think I said this yesterday, but while I'm a representative of IAASB here, I'm also employed at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, and anything that I say are my views, don't represent necessarily the views of the commission or other members of the staff. I fully understand the motivation for the project and the things that the task force is considering, and I think similar to what perhaps Megan and Rob were saying, I think one of the things that we have to be careful of is we don't end up with an outcome where either in reality or perhaps more importantly by perception, it appears that we're carving out some different type of engagement with perhaps some lower level of assurance attached to it. The objective still has to be the performance of a high quality audit, with high quality being defined the same way regardless of the complexity of the entity that is being audited. So I think that is something that we have to keep front and center in the development of this project, that we don't lose sight of that and inadvertently convey a message that this is some different and perhaps lower level of service that is being delivered. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Hussein.
Good morning. Thank you, Jim. Yeah, just in our previous CAG meeting, some of CAG member and also representative of PIOB stated that there is no need for two standards for auditing, because it may be result in unintended inferior standard, superior standard, or good quality audit result, or low quality like that. I know when I read the document, I know there's some pressure from local standard setter or regional standard setter. That there are also some work on setting standard for less complex entities. But I think one set of standard is better than two set of standard, and therefore it should be useful to increase scalability of ISAs and which allow to apply less complex entities. Here, I just was wondering how IAASB convinced PIOB to accept a separate standard set. As I know, due process require to approval of PIOB. Thank you.
Thank you, Hussein. Klaus Norberg.
Thank you. On a general note here, from a business side, I think this project is very much appreciated, and we certainly welcome the project taken on board, because this is a very important issue, given that most companies are small that are audited around the globe and also in Europe. I have a specific question, and that is really maybe jumping a little bit ahead, and that is about how to evaluate the outcome of the two parallel work streams in the future. I take note that the processes going through the work streams are quite different, because the CUSP project is basically a desktop exercise, redrafting, going out, having due process, etc., getting feedback, while, and maybe now I'm preempting the presentation by Kai Morton, but the separate standard projects is also, take note that they also have an ongoing outreach going on at the same time. So And since the approaches are different and also the processes are different, one key issue will be how to frame an evaluation model in the end, so to say, when deciding which way to go, because I think that's quite important. And the issue, for example, of field testing here versus SMEs to apply audit on those companies is a key feature. So it's a part question, part observation from my side about how to move the processes forward until you come to a point for the IASB to evaluate which way to go.
Thank you, Klaus. Ming Wei?
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Thanks, James. Thanks for the presentation. Hello, everyone. I personally hold an open mind on the idea of a separate standard for the audits of LCEs. Well, I would like to point out that investors expect the same high quality financial information and audits from all listed companies. So I think in the process of developing a separate ISA to address the audits of LCEs, my suggestion is to consider how the audit opinions of a separate LCE auditing standards would impact LCE's future potential access to the capital market. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ming. And Daniel Sarmiento.
Good morning. Morning here. We support from Latin America the definition of a single standard. In previous meetings, I had expressed that just as IFRS have a separate standard for SMEs, the ISA should have a separate one for SMPs. Because the degree of complexity and breadth of the ISAs in some cases generates doubts and confusion in the application of the ISA of those standards. So I think it's better for us, at least in this region, to have a separate standard.
Thank you, Daniel. Naomi, your hand went up and down, but I wasn't sure if you had a comment. Do you want to come in with a comment? While you're contemplating, Shago, welcome. Our PROV observer.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation as well. Yes, we did have some concerns about having two standards, but I think our major concern was the allocation of resources of IAASB and the timeline to sort of work on these two work streams. We still have that concern about the timeline. According to the task force or the presentation, one of it will take 4 years. The other one will take 5 years, which is a very long timeline. And in view of the need for these to address these issues, I think there might be ways to reduce that timeline, and I would be very much interested in listening to the views of the CAG representatives on this issue as well.
Thank you, Shago. And just a comment I have, and that is, and I'm sure you're doing this, Roger, you and your task force, but really looking at some of the root causes. My sense is the standards have expanded significantly in volume, but there are those that would argue the reason they've expanded is because there are a lot of things that had to be considered and put in there. And so why is that? And that maybe that goes to the drafting, that first stream that you referred to. But Roger, I will let you respond. You had quite a bit of comments here. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. And look, I'll respond quickly, and a number of the comments were also related to the separate standard. So I'll leave it for Kai and make sure we have some time for him. But just some comments. With the two work streams, we are aiming to maintain the same level of assurance, the high level of assurance, the reasonable assurance under both approaches. It really is a matter of, ensuring how for that particular engagement, we can make the standards most accessible, most scalable in those particular areas. So we are not going to sacrifice in any way the quality of the audit. The definitions was raised, and we do realise that we have to address the definitions because people do come at these things with different areas. The scalability and proportionality, for example, some of those concerns will be addressed through the separate standard, but we will put out there clarity around the definitions so that people can see what we're meaning. How they will run in parallel. What we're learning through just even attempting to draft the separate standard is extremely beneficial as we look at the drafting conventions as to what is working, what we're seeing as far as duplication, what we're seeing as far as repetition. So they are very beneficial to the CUSP work stream. As the CUSP work stream works through its areas, then that will aid in how we draft the words within the separate standard. To the people who raised Clarity Mark II, I don't think the board has any appetite for a Clarity Mark II, Megan. And the board will have to resolve how we do this. I'm expecting that if we can resolve the drafting conventions, this will be on a go-forward basis as standards are opened up. So that this will look at the drafting for standards opened up. We'll also have to have a look and see how that does mean the standards are refreshed over time. The board will give consideration, but it's not going to be to open up the standards, especially given the new standards like 315, 540 that have just been approved and are being put in place. The listed companies will take up or access to future listing as to who can use the separate standard. So there may be some restrictions on that. We are working through that. We'll look at field testing and we are looking at how we can best engage people to feed expertise on the way through. So we have groups, reference groups that we can refer to. And finally, Jim, yes, we are considering root causes. We do need to look at these things because this will give us some idea as to exactly what issues we're looking at that we need to address. We have picked up the root causes on the area on the discussion paper. We'll refer back into that. We've learned a lot through the extensive consultation. But thank you again. I know that it's not unanimous support. Some people have a view as to a particular, but I'm very encouraged by the level of support. I encourage other people to keep an open mind and have a look and see what is coming through on the two work streams and to again feed through any evidence and expertise for our consideration. With that, Chair, I'll pass back to you to continue on the presentation.
Jim, could I come in on the issue of timing and resources? I think it's really important to understand that the CUSP really can't be viewed as a project timeline like others, because as we go along and as we learn things, we'll feed it into the standards development process. So it isn't a 5-year timeline, 7 years timeline. It will permeate everything we do. People are asking us to write standards in plainer English, easier to understand, and developing conventions in sort of real time and approaches will help, and it should feed into our drafted principles. What we haven't done is decided to go back and revise all of our standards according to those principles. My guess will be it will be a flow situation. As new standards get drafted, we'll implement new approaches to that based upon many of the things we're learning now in 315 and ISQM. The other issue is actually, I don't see it as a 4-year timeline on the LCE project, but quite quicker. We're moving quickly, and hopefully we'll have an ED developed. I think it's towards the end of next year. We have due process. This is the users of this standard are the ones who tend to ask for more extended timelines to comment. But what we're trying to do is establish a reference group so we could get feedback throughout the process, that we have a better chance of success. The only other thing is, for those who are skeptical, is the only way we know whether we're producing and achieving our objectives is by trying. If we decided that it was just too hard, we would not be fulfilling a demand that's out there. So yes, we're going to try. We have some very clear operating principles up front, and if we can't achieve them, then we'll have to reconsider our approach. But this is an integrated approach aimed at reducing complexity throughout the whole standard setting process, and hopefully having a targeted approach that deals with the real needs of LCEs without diminishing audit quality.
Thanks, Tom. I think that's an interesting point, that in a way, this has an immediate impact on at least considerations for writing standards just by having the discussion, even though some of the dates seem like they're a little longer out. Roger, I'll bring it back to you.
Thank you, and I'll pass on to Kai for the rest of the presentation.
Okay, for Kai. Okay. Kai, you're up.
Thank you. You can hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Thanks, James. And can you move to the next slide? You now heard Roger speak about the CUSP workstream and the work that's been done between the last time we met. I'll now go a bit into more detail on the development of a separate standard for audits of LCEs, and I can just reiterate the basis for the project is that we will end up with a reasonable assurance opinion, and high quality audit standards is one of the fundamental principles. As with the CUSP workstream, this is very much a focused workstream, and from what you can see on this slide, it's a very ambitious timeline. You can see that we started after the June meeting, so in July this year we started developing the standard. At the December meeting, we will have the project proposal of the project presented for the board. At the same time, we will also have the first draft of a complete standard for discussion within the board. That will be taken back up in the March meeting, have a second round of discussion. And then we will have, we're aiming for an approval of an exposure draft in June 2021. So as you can see, it's a quite ambitious timeline. Within the current environment, I think we're still on track and hope that we will be able to meet the timeline, even though it's ambitious. As Tom alluded to, one of the things we're doing in this project is to test some of the developments as we do test the proposals during the development. So we will socialize some of what we're doing and ask for feedback specifically by the ones that are going to use the standard and the ones that are going to rely on it. So we've established a reference group. I'll speak more about that a bit later. At the same time, it's planned that when we will, after the ED, we're planning to have a third roundtable. We've done 2 Paris conferences before, and we're planning to have a third one as we develop or after we release the ED. So if you can move to the next slide. I heard already some questions about definitions. Part of how we develop the standard as well is driven by who can use the standard. The thinking that we have currently, no distinct decision has been made. But what we're trying to do while we develop this is also to see what are kind of characteristics can drive you in and out of the standard. So we've had this thought that we've been then discussing with the SMP AG and also within the working group and the reference group. Currently, what we're looking at is trying to define what drives the complexity of the audit, which is somewhat different than exactly defining who can use it. We're defining complexity. that is driven by the complexity of the financial statements, the financial reporting requirements, and so on, and can drive so that some, for example, if you have an entity that has complex estimates, the standard will have requirements for estimates, but if you have complex and a lot of estimates, you may be out of the standard. There may also be other nature and circumstances of the entity that may drive you out of using the standard. From the consultation, we also heard quite strongly that there is no appetite for having listed entities within who can use the standard. So currently that's being listed out, saying if you're a listed entity, you cannot use the standard. But as I said, what we're trying to do is develop a short, relative, succinct description. As I said, what we're hearing so far is that it should be on balance more prescriptive, but there will be some evaluation needed to be done by the auditor. So that's kind of the basis we're moving along. As I said, this is our working draft, and what we're doing is trying to see what makes the audit complex. So we can move to the next point. What you see here is the overarching principles that we're developing the separate standard based on. I think, as you can see in the middle, it's the same underlying concepts as we have in the ISAs, and this has also been discussed briefly with the board in June, but also with the reference group and the SMPAG. You already focused on some of the key points here, or in this, that reasonable assurance opinion, high quality audits is the basis for all of this. So it's basically, we're looking at the same principles and concepts as in the ISAs. From the discussions so far, I think we have broadly agreement among most of the principles should apply, and that and that's what we're moving forward on. The areas that we have not decided on, and there are mixed views, I think are summarized in the box at the left-hand corner, the application material and linked back to ISAs. The discussion we had so far, there's been quite strong views, maybe in both directions, whether this should be a fully separate standard or how it should link back and interrelate with the ISAs themselves. So that's one thing we're still discussing and considering how we'll be at the end. I think that discussion is somewhat at least related with the next one around application material. What we presented so far is that the thought is that we will have limited application material, developing the standard for the audits of less complex entities in more linear fashion, more straightforward language. There will be a less need for application material. So that's the assumption we're moving on. I think so far we're limiting, the feedback is that we limit the need for application material, but that may be influenced also by the discussion whether this should be a fully separate or standalone standard or how it should interrelate with the ISAs. Yeah, we can move to the next slide. What you see here is that when we develop the standard, we start with the requirements in the ISAs. And what we try to do, we actually go through each requirement one by one and try to pull out what we would call the core procedures in order to obtain reasonable assurance. So we go through the requirements and then discuss how we can bring that in and be relevant for audits of less complex entities. In some ways, some of the requirements may be brought in word by word. Some of them might be covered more overall, and some requirements will not be picked up at all, which I also alluded to with the applicability. Our thought currently could be that, for example, if you want to rely on work done by internal auditors, there will be no specific material on that in the separate standard. So if you're in that area, you might have to move into the ISAs to get requirements on how, or that you would not be applicable to use the standard. That could be one example of that could be done. So when we write the standard, we're trying to follow some of the thoughts that you heard Roger outline already. Straightforward language. We're trying to develop in the flow of the audit rather than having broken up more than that's in the ISAs today. I think that helps the reading and understandability of the standard and also reduces the need for repetition or cross-referencing. From the drafting we've done so far, I think the feedback we've gotten is that it's easier to follow and for the readers as well. One of the other drafting guidelines we've tried to stick to is that we won't have one paragraph with, let's say, 5 different thoughts, 5 different things you need to do. So more or less one thought per paragraph and short and clear sentences. But at the end, it should be targeted at applying a more effective and efficient audit for audits of less complex entities.
I want to be sure we have time for questions. So.
Sure. There's only one more slide.
Okay.
Yep. Reference group, as I said, we've already had a couple of meetings with the reference group. I think to the end of the year, I think we have 4 more meetings with the reference group. The reference group consists of individuals we typically don't hear from. In addition, we have some representatives from countries that have done or are considering doing a separate standard, so we can get some of their thoughts into the work when we're doing this. It's more or less, as you say here, a pulse check, whether what the direction we're going is usable for the practitioners and also for the people going to rely on the outcome. We also have public sectors. We have also other people. In addition, we're doing outreach as we ordinarily do, and especially with the SMP advisory group. And there, on the working group, there's also a member from the SMP advisory group. I think that was high level what I wanted to talk to on the development of a separate standard. I think that brings us to the questions or the matters for considerations that are on this slide. So I'll hand it back to you, James.
Thank you, Kai. And so we're going to look at these 2 questions. I think we'll handle them together. One is views on separate standards and developing that. I think you've had some feedback on that. And the other is whether there are any other matters that should be considered in relation to these 2 initiatives. So Greg, I see your hand is up.
Thanks, Jim. Good morning. I just had one comment, and I guess it has to do with the applicability of the less complex standard. And it wasn't raised directly in the first roundtable of questions or comments, but it has to do with who can apply the ultimate revised or new set of standards. And the reference to public interest and the further reference to use of funds as being something that might categorize an entity as public interest and therefore potentially scoped out of a less complex standard. And the point I just wanted to raise is that within the public sector, most, if not all, entities are dependent on public funds for their operations. Yet, when you base your discussion on complexity, which is what I understand the driver for this standard will be, there are certainly less complex entities in the public sector. So I just wanted to raise that observation because I think it's an important consideration when looking to things like public interest to drive classification or scope of the application of the revised standards.
Thanks, Greg. Asha?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine.
Okay. Thank you, Roger and Kai, for the detailed presentation of the progress of LCE audit. Sri Lanka Accounting and Auditing Standards Monitoring Board, as an audit regulator, would always support continuing improvements of the standards. But when it comes to the separate audit standards, we as an audit regulator feel that it is something that is required to carry out a proper monitoring mechanism function. And like you see, like currently there are about 78 audit firms who audits about 1,600 entities, which are considered as economical significant entities. It comes under purview, out of which only 18 audit firms are listed entities. So for all these 1,600 entities, the auditors are required to use the full auditing standards. So we feel that most of these non-SBs do not require some of the complex procedures like relating to, in particular, like fraud and some other in-depth procedures in the standard. But also having said that we must also be cautious on simplifying certain aspects like procedures to verify the estimates used in financial statements. And also another thing that I wanted to point out is how it affects the other standards, like in particular the group financial statements, whether the newly revised ISA 600 can accommodate simplified audit of component audits without major changes, and also whether it affects the auditing reporting standards. But currently Sri Lanka does have a separate auditing standard for very small entities, which doesn't come under purview, and it is also not gazetted. So those companies which are not economically significant, they are called not economically significant companies. So depending on the size of the engagement, the audit firms, provided that they are in line with the global requirements, they have the option to use either the standards for non-SBs, that is the companies that are not economically significant, or they can use the full IFRS. But we as a regulator are of the view that when a separate global standard, which has gone through a lot of detailed studies, is issued for LSC audits, like it would really help us, because when IAASB issues the standards, that is like our local standards are integrated in line with the global standards. So our act also allows only to review the standards that are gazetted. Thank you. That is a comment that I have to make.
Thank you, Asha. Paul Sobel?
Yes, thank you. This looks very encouraging, definitely heading in the right direction. Had a comment on in the attached document of issues and recommendations. There's a kind of a decision tree, which I think is very good. It very helpfully illustrates the thinking. I was a little bit concerned about, there's a fairly big box in the professional judgment area about, does the entity being audited exhibit one or more of the following characteristics? And it seems to me just one characteristic would not necessarily push you to a yes. It obviously would be require professional judgment. So again, strong support for that sort of a decision tree. Just make sure it doesn't maybe make it too easy for somebody to justify that they are a less complex entity. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Naomi Robert?
Yes, thank you, James, and good afternoon, everybody. I would like to convey Accountancy Europe's support as well for this project, Kai Morten. And so I had difficulty connecting with my sound earlier, so I would like to support the parallel work stream as well. So the part from Roger, and I assume that Kai Morten, you are dedicated to this one. I would like to support as well the offensive timeline. So let's hope that the board will follow as well. Regarding which entities should apply this potential separate standard, I think that this will be up to legislators and regulators as well. So there may be a need to connect to regulators as early as possible in order to get buy-ins from them during this project, because you have your reference group. I think this is with practitioners, so to bounce back on technical issues, but regarding regulators, it may be, what would push them for accepting such standard or not. And so again, full support for the test fields as early as possible, I would think as well. And I agree with your, like your conditions of reasonable assurance, quality audit, etc. So, thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Hyson. Hyson?
You hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah. Also, EFAA support the initiative for developing this separate standard or standalone standard, and we strongly believe that the standard will be applicable not only for the compulsory audit for SMEs, but also for so-called contractual audit. And the timeline is okay, because this will help to avoid, how to say, the idea of countries to develop their own standards, which will create much more difficulties in the future for any we think that this how to say, the applicability issues should have been into the consideration, and
Hyson, you seem to have faded out, at least on my screen, but I think we got the nature of your comments. Thank you.
Okay.
Kazuhiro.
Thank you, James, and thank you.
Speak a little louder, please.
Thank you. Thank you, James, and thank you for good presentation for Kai. I'd like to talk about the target of LCE standards. As many CAG's members have already at the past meeting and described in this presentation document, page 11, even when developing auditing standards for LCEs, a listed company should be excluded from LCEs. Users of financial statements must hope that the same quality auditing standards will be applied to audit of the financial statements of the companies which they could invest. Listed companies that prepare financial statements will also want to maintain the same level of auditing as other companies.
Thank you. Japan, I'm sorry. Thank you, Katsuhiro.
In Japan, financial institutions and large companies under the Companies Act are also required to receive an audit by CPA, even if they are not listed. And the same auditing standards should be applied to audits of such companies. And furthermore, is it desirable that the same auditing standards are applied to the subsidiaries of these companies, even if they may be LCE? If a large overseas subsidiary receives audit on standards that differ from those of the parent company due to its simple business, the quality of the consolidated financial statements of parent company may not be maintained. On the other hand, in Japan, unlisted companies other than financial institutions and large corporations under company law are not required to receive audits by CPA. And almost all of them have probably not received audits by CPA. if LCE auditing standards were introduced. If LCE audit standards were introduced, and financial institution would require such unlisted companies to receive LCE-based accountant audits as a condition for loans. The quality of financial statements of them would be expected to improve. Thank you.
Thank you, Katsuhiro. Natasha.
Excuse me, just trying to get myself unmuted. Thank you. I really briefly just wanted to echo this broader concern about the potential creation of a two-tier system and the need to be incredibly cautious around that, and also to take a broader approach to not permitting PIEs more generally, so beyond just listed companies, to adopt what could potentially be viewed as a weaker set of standards. I think clearly from an investor perspective, looking beyond listed companies because of the credit markets, but also just ensuring there's a level playing field out there in the market where you may have listed companies competing with unlisted companies and wanting to have the same sort of standards across the piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Galen Hansen.
I'll be very brief because I know we're short on time. So I do agree with the comments that just preceded me from Natasha. I think that if we're going forward with this, it should be applied to all PIE should be scoped out. So this is basically a question of scoping, I think, in the early stages. And I did have a related question. Is this an all or nothing proposition? So if you're if you're determined to be a less complex entity, then you have to apply all the LCE standards that are designated as LCE, or do you get to pick and choose? So it's one of whether it's piecemeal or not. And then I had another question, and if in fact an LCE standard is applicable and followed, is there any transparency reporting to the public, in the audit report or elsewhere?
Thank you, Galen. Henry Rees.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Kai and Roger, for the very informative presentations this morning. I'm sorry I can't share video, just my internet connection is just not great at the moment. Just wanted to say that very much support the development of the separate standard. I can see the challenges that are highlighted in the discussion, and I can see it's not entirely the same considerations that you get with thinking about the IFRS for SME standard, which is essentially a standalone standard, versus full IFRS. But I think there will still be many benefits, very similar benefits that we saw from the SME standard that will come from this separate standard. And I think the parallel work streams, I think it's really good. That I think it'll be very helpful, and definitely see how the work from each will inform each other. I know from drafting, accounting standards myself, one can learn a lot from thinking about our own SME standard. Just wanted to just flag that the IFRS Foundation currently is actually consulting on its strategy for the future of its IFRS for SME standard. And so the standard hasn't been revised for a few years, but we will be thinking about some of the questions that are touched on here, which is, should it continue to align with full IFRS with modifications, or could the requirements be developed more independently from full IFRS? So that's a currently ongoing consultation. Just thinking about the question of who it's for, I just wanted to highlight that I just think it's really important that ultimately the IAASB is very clear about who it's intending this standard to be for, because undoubtedly that will affect its content and how it's drafted. And that's really regardless of what local regulations might be, or what firms might choose to allow in some circumstances. So I actually did just wonder about the flow chart, whether or not in the flow chart, whether I would refer to what local regulations or firms and networks allow and just focus on what the IAASB's intention is of who this is for. The other thing that I just wanted to quickly highlight was that it was good to see how there are jurisdictions who you don't normally hear from getting involved in the process, and I think that's excellent. So just was thinking about, and I'm sure this is being thought about, but given the target audience for this standard, just thinking about, are there different ways to engage in the formal consultation process, perhaps using online surveys and things like that to really try and reach stakeholders that you don't normally hear from to get as wide as feedback as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. And last we have Hussein.
Thank you, Jim. My comment is about scope of standard. I think this new separate standard should include listed companies and also in capital market as to help the functioning of market. There are some critical entities like settlement entities, custody entities, intermediaries, institutions, investment companies. There are lots of other companies, institutes, and in most of the jurisdiction, these companies also prepare their financial statement according to IFRS and subject to audit, audited by ICE auditors with the application of ISAs. Therefore, I think these entities also should be excluded. Public interest entities, I think it should be excluded, but maybe public interest entities cover lots of companies. Therefore, during the consideration of to which entities, what is the less complex entities, this issue should be considered because for the integrity of capital market, especially in our jurisdiction in Turkey, both capital market institution and listed companies subject to similar accounting standard, auditing standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Hussein. So Kai, you have quite a bit of feedback. I think the only other comment I would have myself is that I think and you probably have done this, is think about, or would there be any unintended consequences in terms of doing this separate standard. So Kai, I'll just send it back to you to see if you have any final thoughts from this feedback, and then we'll have to close the session.
And thank you all for the good comments and interest in the work that we're doing. I'll just give 2 short comments in the interest of time. There's been a lot of referencing back to the flow chart and the thinking behind that. I think that was based on the June papers, and the working group are thinking on the applicability has moved on, as you saw from the presentation. So I'm not saying we won't have a flow chart, but the thinking behind that flow chart has changed. And the applicability, I think what we will do is develop what the standard is intended for, and then there will always be room for regional legislation to decide who can use the standard or not. Also, we are very cautious on the risk of developing a tutor system, and that this audit will not be seen as a lower level audit. So that's not the intention. So it needs to be the same level of assurance, and that's the impression that the users will need to have. So in the interest of time, I'll just thank you all for the comments. We will take them with us moving forward, and I guess we'll be reporting back to you again later on this year or next year. Thank you. Back to you, James.
Thank you, Kai, and I believe there's more to come on this. Certainly some great conversation. So we're going to transition right now to a different subject, but equally important, and that's fraud and going concern. Josephine, we're going to give the floor to you. And
lovely, thanks, Jim. Thank you very much. Well, good morning, evening, and afternoon to you all. And we probably have just under 40 minutes or so for this next session on fraud and going concern before the break. As you read in the cover note, and may also recall from the discussion, in March about our strategy and work program, one of the most relevant strategic drivers influencing our standards and future activities includes the need to address changing confidence in audits. And in that vein, work in relation to the expectation gap that exists in relation to fraud and going concern is part of the board's information gathering and research work program. So since before March, indeed, staff, in particular Angela and Bev, along with the support of our Deputy Chair Fiona, have been working very hard in the background to meet certain milestones. So today we will be updating the CAG on the achievements so far and the major themes identified, along with, of course, our next steps. As it is all Angela and Bev's hard work, my task is actually very simple today, and Angela will be delivering the presentation, which you will see on the screen, of course, but you can also find in agenda item F1 of the CAG papers. And Angela will also cover some of the detailed themes explored in our discussion paper, which for reference was in the CAG papers F.2, which is due to be published early next week. So indeed, that's it for me for now, and I'm going to hand over to Angela. Thank you, Angela.
Great, thank you, Josephine, and good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. It's nice to see you. So as Josephine mentioned, so we've kicked off the information gathering activities for both the topics of fraud and going concern, and I'll talk a little bit about what we've achieved so far, as well as what we've planned for the coming months. And at this point, the activities have really been largely staff-driven, with Fiona overseeing the fraud workstream and Josephine overseeing the going concern workstream. But we do plan to have the task force groups for each of these projects kick off later this year in Q4. So with that said, so this first slide just shows a summary of everything we've completed to date with these two work streams, what we have in process and what we have planned. So to step through what we've completed, first, in order to sort of target the research activities that we wanted to plan, we collated all of the comments that we received through other IAASB projects, whether that was 315 or 540, the implementation monitoring project, as well as the strategy work plan. Anything where fraud or going concern was mentioned, we sort of brought all of those comments into one place and layered on top of that observations from publications or reviews performed in other jurisdictions, such as the Bryden Review and others. And from there, we also had our annual meeting with the NSS group and received specific input from the NSS group as well. And from there, we identified key themes for both fraud and going concern that helped us develop our plan forward and our plan for more targeted outreach and research. And so of those key themes, there were really two buckets. One was, there were a few main topics where we thought these are the ones where we really need to dive in deeper at this stage and do some more targeted outreach. And then there were some where we got a lot of consistent feedback. We hear the issues, we know what the issues are, and from there we want to kind of take those to task force brainstorming and think about more about what we do about those topics. But the three areas where we decided to hold roundtables and do a little bit more research and outreach prior to the brainstorms are the expectation gap with regards to fraud and going concern, as Josephine mentioned. Also technology related to fraud, and thirdly, the procedures related to less complex entities. So you'll see those on some of the following slides, but ultimately those 3 areas were where we planned our additional activities. So just stepping through this slide a bit more, also in our completed activities at this point. So knowing that we wanted to get more information on the expectation gap with regards to fraud and going concern, we drafted a discussion paper that steps through some of the things that we've heard so far in relation to this topic, but also poses questions to get broad feedback from all stakeholders. That discussion paper was discussed with the board at the August 11th board call, and the near final version was provided to this group just for reference. And that's going through one last review before we plan to publish next week sometime. And in addition, just last week, we completed a technology-focused fraud roundtable. That event, it gave us the opportunity to get a lot of rich feedback from various stakeholders, which included forensic auditors, financial statement auditors, audit methodology experts, academics, regulators, third-party audit solutions, public sector representatives, and some others. And the conversation was very rich. We were able to sort of dive deep and do breakout sessions to make sure that we were getting, a good amount of feedback from the different groups. Some of the key highlights that were discussed, just to name a few, were, the fact that ISO 240, in the last 15 years, whether it's focusing on sort of the right areas based on the evolving environment and emerging technologies. And so making sure that we sort of revisit it with the lens of the current environment. That some procedures maybe should be more forward-looking with the technologies that are available today in terms of identifying risks. Some of the participants stepped through some of the technologies that they use, such as data analytics or machine learning to identify anomalies. And so I think, that we really did get a lot of rich feedback that, we'll be sort of dissecting and potentially having follow-up calls with some of the participants to learn even more going forward. So then moving into the in-process bucket, we are doing an academic desktop review, and that's certainly well underway and has been incorporated into some of our materials to date. We received about over 200 reports total between fraud and going concern that we're going through and making sure we're considering in our work. And then, as mentioned, we're finalizing the discussion paper on the expectation gap. And then in terms of the activities that we have planning, that planning has commenced, we have a roundtable discussion that we're planning about the expectation gap. So this is really sort of tailing off of that discussion paper in order for us to dive deeper into those topics and make sure that we're getting feedback from, specifically investors, analysts, preparers, those charged with governance. Making sure that we're getting feedback specifically from that stakeholder group, and that will be scheduled for September 28th. In addition, that session will also, just as an aside, it will also include discussion about the auditor reporting post-implementation, making sure we're getting feedback on those new and revised standards from that stakeholder group as well. Then October 7th, we'll have a roundtable for fraud and going concern procedures for less complex entities. So planning is, we've just started planning for that session as well. And then we'll be having, as I mentioned, task force working group brainstorming meetings. We'll be holding the fraud session in October and the going concern session in November. And then this last bullet here is just to note that we're coordinating with others as needed. So Karen, if you can move to the next slide, please. So this slide here is really just to note that, especially for going concern, we do have a critical point of collaboration with the IAASB. So this is just to note that, as we move forward with this one, we recognize that there may be changes that are necessary to the accounting standard in order for us to make changes to the audit standard. Next slide, please. This slide here really just summarizes everything I just discussed, but the one thing I'll just mention, so the themes at the left show sort of 1 through 3 are the ones where we have those planned targeted outreach activities. The bucket in category 4 here are some of the things that we heard from stakeholders where we saw these comments over and over, and we'll be incorporating this into the brainstorming discussions that we have with the task force in Q4. Just to name a few, with journal entry testing, the rebuttable presumption of significant risk of fraud and revenue recognition, and some others. Next slide, please. This slide here just shows some of the detailed themes explored in the discussion paper. So I won't go through this whole slide, but in case you haven't had a chance to look at the discussion paper, this goes through some of the matters that we've heard about that topic, and some of the things that we explore in that paper. So just to name a few are, the potential for required use of forensic specialists, specific requirements to address risk of third-party fraud, enhanced professional skepticism, enhanced auditor reporting requirements. So I won't go through all of these, but this is really just for your reference. Next slide, please. And then same for going concern. This is sort of a similar slide here. So you can see that we had the theme of the expectation gap for going concern, and then that second category there shows targeted enhancements that were suggested that we want to discuss in our working group brainstorm, specifically around going concern. So some of these were like better linkage to other ISAs, communications with those charged with governance, potentially adding a decision tree to application material. So some comments that we heard multiple times that we'll discuss with the brainstorm. And next slide, please. And then this one has the matters that we discuss in the discussion paper related specifically to going concern. And so again, won't go through all of the points in this slide just in the interest of time, but some of the things that we talk about in the discussion paper would be, again, professional skepticism, auditor reporting, clarifying the concept of going concern and the definition of a material uncertainty, alignment between accounting and auditing standards, et cetera. And then last slide, Karen. And this is really my last slide in the presentation, and this is just to outline the timeline for our planned activities. So you can see sort of the top half there shows that in the next couple months through November, we've got these 2 additional roundtables scheduled. The discussion paper will be going out, and we've got the brainstorming discussions, all with the goal of providing the board with updates on each of these projects in December and February, respectively, for fraud and going concern. And then we'll be coming back to the CAG with an update in March 2021. So with that said, I'll just look to Bev and see if there's anything additional. Nothing? Okay, great. So we don't have any specific questions that we have on these topics, but we do want to get feedback from the group generally. So I think at this point, maybe Jim, Chair, if we could get feedback from the group on these topics or on anything that I discussed today, that'd be great.
Thank you, Angela. I wanted to open it up for questions, and I'm sure we're going to have some questions that come through. While we're waiting for questions, I'll share one of my comments, and that is, if you look at some of the more spectacular frauds, at least in recent history, and you somewhat diagram them, there's a if you had some the auditors had some sort of stand back to answer the question, does this really make sense if for whatever the factors were, whether it's revenues that were unrealistically increasing or other factors. It seems like that there would be red flags that would appear. And it's pretty consistent if you look at some of these diagrams of these frauds. So hopefully, I said this before in one of the other sessions, sort of the root causes, I think from time to time auditors jump into the detail, let's look at XYZ, whereas if they had just stood back and sort of looked from an overall perspective, it might have connected the dots better. And so hopefully that will be an element of your work. Okay. Hussein, I'm not sure your hand is up, but that may be related to the previous discussion. So I'm gonna, okay. Natasha.
Hi, thank you very much. Really comprehensive presentation. And I'm afraid I should just start by saying I haven't actually read that discussion paper in detail as yet, but I definitely intend to, and I'm glad to see you're doing outreach to investors on this. I guess just a couple of high-level things. Just, James, your point on that stand back kind of view that is really needed to ensure that the mindset is not just one of compliance with standards, but actually do these accounts at the end of the day deliver in the UK what we talk about as a true and fair view or a fair representation is so critical. And one of the issues that we have been concerned about, so certain investors within the UK, is what exactly takes place under that stand back exercise, which is already a requirement in the UK. It's that true and fair view opinion that an auditor delivers alongside the compliance with the standards opinion. So what steps actually have been undertaken to give that opinion? So in other words, right now an auditor will simply sign off both those opinions. They sign off the compliance with the standards, and secondly, they sign off that true and fair view opinion. But there's never any additional disclosure of, we did this, this, and this to fulfill that second opinion. And I think that would enhance, the value of that second stand back opinion enormously. So that may be a useful observation for you. The other thing, a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, is this phrase expectations gap. That I find problematic because it presumes that the fault lies with those with the expectations. They have a gap in their expectations. Now, I think without prejudging it, I think, there could well be a delivery gap here. Then in fact, the expectations are absolutely right, but the accounts or the auditor is failing to deliver to the requisite expectations. So I just would urge some consideration of that when we use these sorts of phrases, because it immediately presumes that there's a problem with the users of those audits rather than with the audits themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Dawn.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to express my support for this project. It's a very important topic, and I'm sure we can all really appreciate how critical this is in the current environment and the changes that we've had to undertake in our auditing and planning for engagements of late. I know I've been spending a lot of time discussing these issues with staff members and reworking files and all that kind of thing. I also support the approach using the virtual roundtables. I think that's an excellent way to garner feedback and to keep on top of things on a timely basis. I wanted to let you know that the SMP is planning on responding to the discussion paper, so you can look forward to that feedback as well. And I also support the engagement with the IAASB. I think that's going to be really important as you work through the project.
Thank you, Don. Naomi.
Thank you, Jim. I'm just seeing that I am sharing Brussels sunlight with you. It's a gift from my side. So yeah, regarding the Natasha's comment on the expectation gap, and it looks like the presentation, or at least the background paper, was very much focused on this concept, and I would agree that this is misleading and we should be careful not to focus too much on this. I agree that it could be delivery gap. We often also talk about quality gap or even communication gap if it's just a matter of explaining what the auditor has really done. So there I know that there are some academic research done on these gaps, and there may be a need to look at that further. Maybe you have already done so, I don't know. I understand that a lot is on your group's shoulder, but a lot is also on the way. So when I say that, I'm talking about the quality management projects, this audit evidence new project as well. It's very much linked to the new ISA 315. So you will need to take all of that is coming up into account, I assume, in this project. And I agree that it's good to coordinate with the IAASB, but it's, like the ISAs are not only applicable to auditors that audit financial statements under IFRS. So I'm just wondering if this could be a potential issue at some point. And then there is also a need to connect with other stakeholders, so through the full financial reporting chain, because I agree that the auditor should do the job, should do it with quality, but there may be other actors in this financial chain that should do more as well. I'm talking about management, those charged with governance that should report also more. And so there is a need for a holistic approach here. And this is definitely part of your project. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Let's see, we have Meng Wei.
Hey, hello, James.
Hello.
Thank you. I appreciate the project update on fraud and going concern, and thanks for the work has been done. Fraud and going concerns are global issues that impact the capital market investors. Diverse business practices and local risks environment are all factors contributing to some of the fraud and going concern cases. In my view, forming a diverse group of working group members from all major capital markets around the globe will be helpful. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Munter.
Great, thank you, Jim, and thank you very much for the presentation and the work here. Couple of quick observations. Like a couple of others, I get concerned about using the term expectation gap. I mean, I can think back years ago when the Auditing Standards Board in the U.S. issued a suite of standards. I guess that goes back about 35 years ago in the mid 80s to, quote, address the expectation gap. And here we are nearly half a century later, still talking about that. And maybe it's tone, I'm not sure, but I find that a lot of times when we talk about expectation gap, we end up talking more about what an audit is not as opposed to what an audit is. And I think we need to steer the conversation both in terms of helping users understand, but also reinforcing to auditors themselves as to what the objectives and the responsibilities are. The paper documents a number of very high profile audit failures that have occurred over the last few years. And so there are certainly evidence that there are audit failures that do occur. Therefore, that performance gap that is identified in the paper certainly is present in some audits. I'm not asserting it's widespread necessarily, but it does exist. But I'd like to see us focus more on the what it is, what the responsibilities are, as opposed to the what it is not. The other observation I have is I think discussion about technology, how that impacts the assessment and the ability to detect fraud is certainly good, but I worry, particularly in an environment like we're in now, that as more things are migrated to a remote or virtual approach, what that does from the standpoint of the auditor's assessment, by which I mean, when you're doing an audit, you can learn an awful lot about tone at the top, corporate culture, etc., through things like walkthroughs and conversations with key personnel, etc., where you're face to face and you can read body language and you can read tone, which are not necessarily things you can get from a virtual environment or from emails and the like. So I hope we don't lose sight of the valuable information that an auditor can gain through in-person, assuming an auditor is alert to clues, but through valuable in-person communication and reading the tone of the organization, because I think so often what we have seen when we do a retrospective on audit failures, it is the auditor has failed to identify red flags, oftentimes about the tone at the top and or the culture of the organization. Thank you.
Paul, it would be very interesting to go back to one of those conversations in the 1980s with that standard setting group and see how similar that discussion was to what we're seeing today. And Conchita, you are now on the floor, or have the floor.
Thank you. Generally, with respect to the planned activities, I support them. I just noted, well, a lot of things that were earlier stated, I share some of those ideas. But I'm just wondering, because the fraud focus roundtable already occurred. This is the fraud focus technology roundtable. I'm just wondering if we can be brief on the highlights, because this is very interesting, because this is already public consultation. Because if we wait for the next meeting, that may take a while, and this is a current issue. I'm just wondering if highlights can be shared now, because I'm really very interested on the impact of technology on what auditors are doing. Thank you, if that is possible.
Thank you, Conchita. Let's see, Kazuhiro.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, good presentation. I have a brief comment. I'd like to support this project and make efforts to obtain correct comments from Japanese investors and analysts after the DP is published. I think many users will be interested in the going concern as related to the death sentence to the company. Regarding the expectation gap of audit, knowledge gap, performance gap, and the evolution gap are listed as the factors in agenda item F2. But in order to narrow the knowledge gap, investors and other users of financial statements need to be interested in audit. Can will be the catalyst for this, but the dissemination of transparency reports will also help. Thank you.
Thank you, Katsuhiro. And we have two more comments, it looks, so I'm going to call on both those individuals. The first one is Henry.
Thanks very much, Jim. I just want to say a few words about the going concern, if that's okay, and just to acknowledge and say that it's been good that this topic has been one of specific discussions between the IAASB and my organization, the IASB, and I look forward to that continuing, obviously, as well. What I did just want to highlight to everybody is just to explain that actually the IASB at the moment doesn't have anything ongoing concern on the active agenda, but clearly over the last few months we have been actively talking to our stakeholders to support them and support implementation of our standards, and questions about going concern do come up, but mainly on when and what disclosures are required. And also we get questions about the basis of preparation when a company isn't a going concern. And so we've been supporting some of the educational efforts that have been going on just to remind people about what actual disclosures are required. The other point I just wanted to highlight is that the discussion paper does highlight that there are some who think there should be more specific disclosures in IFRS standards around going concern, particularly when there's significant doubt about the going concern assessment or there are material uncertainties. And we will be discussing this there's an international meeting of some national standard setters, large group of national standard setters later this month. So that'll be interesting feedback, I think. And the IASB is also going to be doing its agenda consultation early next year. And so that'll give people an opportunity to provide views to the IASB, reflecting on recent experience and whether, going concern is now one of those topics that becomes more of an agenda priority. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that information. And Christian?
Thank you, Jim. So first of all, I think I would like to chime in and say that the expression itself, the expectation gap, might be misleading, though I did want to point out that this term was defined in I think to my best knowledge, 1974 by Liggio the first time. He was trying to have a structured approach. So I would like to encourage the project team to continue at least with the idea to have a structured approach, looking at the different gaps we are facing. If it is substituted or packed under the expression of an expectation gap, we can talk about naming this gap in a different manner. But I think we do need a framework. If we discuss different and several responses to those issues we have seen in the past, whether it was going concern issues or whether it was failure with respect to fraud, so that those ideas that are brought up by governments, especially here in Europe currently, that they can be put into a structure addressing certain gaps we are currently facing. So I think the idea of the structured approach is highly appreciated from my side, and we are Accountancy Europe is doing a similar thing in the AAPG. So let's see where we end up.
Thank you, Christian. It's interesting, similar to my comment to Paul. Back in the 80s, for those of us that were working in the auditing world in the 80s, that expectation gap was a discussion point back then. So I guess what's old becomes new again, or something like that. I think we have a PIOB perspective, and that's Shago.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. I think everybody knows that PIOB welcomes and support this initiative, and I think it's very important from the public interest perspective. And we also think it's a very important and timely initiative. We appreciate that IAASB has included this in the work program. And in that sense, we very much look forward to the views expressed by the stakeholders to the discussion paper. And in particular, we would be very much interested in listening to the views about whether a corresponding change will be made to the accounting standard, will be made or can be made. I enjoyed the presentation by Angela, but she sort of explained the third page of this document, going concern coordination with IAASB, just to note this issue. But I would think that this is the key issue, and how to address this key issue is, I think, we are very much interested in listening to the CAG representatives and also the stakeholders' view on this issue. And we'll see how it goes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shago. Rob.
Yeah, sort of continuing on Shago's line of thinking, I guess just thinking out loud, where are we going with this? In other words, expectation gap, performance gap, and I think it is a bit more of an expectation gap, because if you look at the literature, the accountant is responsible for managing fraud, not the auditor. So what's the end game? Are we looking to change the auditor's responsibility, revise ISA 240, I guess it is, or are we looking to educate the readers of the financials? So that's kind of the disconnect I'm having, if you can help me with that.
Okay. I think that's all the questions we have. I'm going to turn it back to Josephine or Angela for any comments you have.
Yeah,
thanks. Comments.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jim. I'll pick up on a couple of comments. Just generally, thanks to the CAG, all extremely helpful, and thank you also for the support, which is very clearly coming through. And so I'll pick up a couple of comments, and then I'll hand to Angela and Bev if they want to supplement them or fill in the gaps for me. On the expectation gap, yes, of course, it's a fair point, Natasha. What we have done in the paper is try to take that research we've got, including academic research, which was mentioned by some, and just set them up as three different types. There is a performance gap, which in summary is where the auditors don't quite do what they should do in accordance with the auditing standards. There is a knowledge gap where there really is a difference between what people believe auditors do when they perform their work under a financial statement audit and what actually is the reality. And then, of course, the evolution gap. So where areas of the audit where there is a need for change. And so we have covered those three areas in our paper and focused primarily on the knowledge gap and the evolution gap. We also, Paul, thank you, yeah, those observations on expectation gap. Hopefully my point covers those. Henry, fantastic news about work going on at the IAASB. That's incredibly helpful to know. And certainly we look forward to working with you on this going forward, and particularly in relation to the feedback that you'll be getting from your NSS meetings. That will be particularly helpful to our project. And I believe in terms of the other comment on taking a structured approach, we are intending to take a structured approach, Christian, and we did try and lay that out in our discussion paper. Obviously, there's some more areas that we'll be brainstorming in the working groups, which aren't directly covered in the expectation, but directly covered in the discussion paper. But no doubt some of those comments will come through, hopefully, by our respondents. And I believe those are really the only two areas I did want to comment on specifically. Angela, Bev, perhaps on the timelines or any other comments that our CAB representatives raised?
Yep, I'll go first. Just to raise, I heard a couple comments about just the broader financial reporting ecosystem and the importance of acknowledging that there are other players in the game. And so that is something that we've brought into the discussion paper to just mention that management, those charged with governance, regulators, et cetera, there are other players in the financial reporting ecosystem, and that collectively all stakeholders need to think about sort of their role in helping to narrow the gap. And in terms of the roundtables, we are considering how best to sort of summarize the highlights and the key feedback that's coming off of these roundtables, and we'll be sure to make that the CAG gets whatever summary that we do prepare on that in the future. And so maybe I'll turn it over to Bev to see if she has anything additional.
Thanks, and I think the last point that I just wanted to make was on Rob's question about where we're going with this. I think that's the point. We don't know. We're trying to work out whether we do actually need to do changes to the standards. And I think that's why we use this concept of expectation gap. And I know, or we're very mindful that people see it in very different ways, but we did see it as a way to help facilitate some of the conversation, because what we're really trying to do here is work out, do we need standards? So we have a reasonable assurance opinion. How much work does the auditor actually have to do? There may be an unreasonable expectation as to what that is, but in today's world, which has evolved since when 240 was actually developed, we may actually need to do more. So that's really what we're trying to do, is to try and see whether there is something additional that is required today to get to that reasonable assurance opinion. So with that, Jim, thanks. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Bev. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Josephine. Appreciate your feedback, and thank you for all the CAG members. I thought that was a very good discussion, both on LCE earlier and on fraud and going concern. This is going to lead us right into our break, so we will return at 9 o'clock and talk about the work plan. I'll see everyone at 9. Thank you. I'd like to welcome everyone back. Welcome back from the break, and we're going to move to the IAASB work plan. I'm going to turn it over to the IAASB chair. Tom, you have the floor.
Hi, how are you? Thanks, Jim, and thanks for, I've been listening intently to the discussion and the very rich discussion that was had, and obviously going concern and fraud are a very early stage. I did want to say on that topic with the IAASB, I've spoke to Hans last week, and you hear Henry, there is a real, continued desire to coordinate throughout. So I'm really appreciative of the spirit and the relationship we have with the IAASB. And we also know that it's only one of many financial reporting frameworks, but obviously it's the one that is most pervasive throughout the world. So thanks to the IAASB, and we look forward to sharing our information throughout the process. One of the things that we all have been coping with, and it's permeated the project, is how COVID-19 and the pandemic and how our work habits are affecting the way we work and our outputs. The good thing for us at the IAASB is it's sort of right after we met last time is that we published our strategy. And the strategy should be able to hold up throughout all circumstances, and it should be adaptable enough to lead you in the right direction. It serves as North Star. And remember, our strategy was really about having a clear public interest focus and doing so in three ways, which was one is making sure that we had the right topics on our agenda, work program, finishing what we started, a lot of the foundational efforts, and then turn into these emerging issues such as fraud, going concern, audit evidence, issues of technology, LCE, complexity. Secondly, it was about really becoming a lot more agile and innovative in the way that we worked. And third was in having this sort of radical form of engagement that we're engaging in communities. Those 3 points really put us in good stead. And we had a work program developed along those ways, and you had many opportunities to comment on it. But when the crisis hit, and the pandemic hit, which really sort of hit all of us around the world at the time of the last CAG meeting, we were able to use those 3 strategic objectives to guide our response. If you could flip the page, please. And so we sort of viewed our approach with assist, adapt, and coordinate. And so by assist, this means is how could we help our stakeholders and the users ultimately of external reports to understand the implications of the crisis. And we wanted to get on the front foot. So can we put out meaningful guidance in a rapid fashion to help understand how our standards apply in the circumstances? One of the things we heard was that the standards were holding up pretty well, but there were areas in which people could use guidance. And I'll get back to that in a second. Second thing, can we adapt our working the way we work, also to account for the way the stresses on the people who are applying our standards and also the stakeholder organizations. And so one of the things we did, obviously we were able to move to a virtual environment very quickly. And we had Zoom up and running actually for board meetings before the pandemic. So that was a useful switch. We use cloud-based technology. So it was able for us to move quickly, but we were also able to adapt to virtual board meetings pretty quickly as well. And then we started to think about our timetables and really focus on our core priorities up front. And to us, that was getting 600 out the door for exposure draft. This was getting QM done in a manner that was quick as possible, but didn't compromise quality, hence the extension throughout the summer. and extending some comment periods, and particularly on 600 where appropriate, and then coordinate. One of the things I learned about this crisis, as you learn when running this organization, is that you can never communicate too much. This has happened at the staff level, but with our stakeholders, we instituted regular meetings with a coordinated group of national standard setters where we're sharing information about our response. We're posting all the information that's being guidance that's going out. We're trying to make sure that we're not duplicating and causing confusion. We're speaking with the IAASB on regular occasions as well. I have intensive contact with the PIOB and the monitoring group. And obviously we're through a reform process, so managing that as well. But really this idea of tight coordination and communications with our key stakeholders and the practitioner community, whether it's through IFAC or the GPPC or the SMPC, the Edinburgh group. So we really, in some extent, have met with more people throughout this crisis than we had before. I don't expect that to diminish. What we're learning is that there's probably in the long term is a mix of these type of technological interactions plus in-person interactions will make our process better. If you flip the slide one more time, in terms of assist, this is a huge kudos really to the staff. It's always a good reminder to tell you that we have a staff, a technical staff, I think it's right around a dozen at any given point, but particularly Bev as it relates to staff alert, we were able to get a large number of staff alerts out quickly, which required some board review, but not all board interaction in person. And this was the way we were able to be helpful to the community. So we have 6 out, 2 to come. And from what I've heard, they've been well received. They're not meant to be substitutes for revised standards or ongoing work, but it's meant to key up issues on how to apply our current standards, which we think are holding up well because they're principle-based, to an environment that people could not expect to go forward. And to some extent, this crisis is a real stress test of our existing standards and will be informing our work, such as going concern and fraud as we take those projects on. So that's our approach, our general approach as we've hit this crisis and how we've used our strategy, which we thank you all for being such important inputs to the process going forward. But we think that's holding up quite well. I could pause there for a second if anyone has immediate reaction, or I could hand it over to Billy.
Let me see if we have any questions, Tom.
Billy's going to go into some more specifics about the work plan. So
why don't we move into the Billy discussion? Billy?
I think he may be having issues, so I'll do the session until he comes back.
Okay.
If we can have the next slide, please. Thanks. So as Tom had alluded to, we had to take a step back and think about what we were doing. Obviously, we've had to make various changes to accommodate the virtual nature of meetings. I think in particular, we just don't have the same number of hours that we ordinarily would have with our stakeholders, the CAG meeting, the board meeting. And also in thinking through what we were giving to our stakeholders, we really thought carefully about the timelines. So what we did was we took a step back and we had a look at what was really important in our priority projects. Obviously, our priority projects at that point in time were the quality management projects. We wanted to make sure that they had enough time. So we had pushed those out to September approvals. The extra time just took account of the volume that was coming through and the coordination that was needed in an environment that we hadn't expected. So obviously those are coming to our September meeting. Coming out of that, we obviously thought, well, we'll have a lighter June board meeting again, as our board members and TAs and the staff were adjusting to the new environment and the volume that was coming through, particularly in their day jobs, they had to make changes themselves. We also thought that we would have a lighter June board meeting. I think those that attended the June board meeting might not have said it was that much lighter, but it was probably lighter than some of the more recent board meetings that we have had. So coming out of all of that, we've had to adjust the timing on some of our topics. So we've had to push some conversations out. So things like audit evidence and the CUSP project. Ideally, we would have had conversations about them now in September and December. Some of those have been pushed out to December and January or February. We have put in some new board calls and really just had a look at how we can actively manage the workload while getting the work done. And in pushing out the timelines, I think what we've done is we've managed, we may have less conversations with the board, but we have managed to make sure that we haven't pushed out any of the targeted deadlines. At this point, some of the projects, fraud and going concern, we've just talked about that. There's a lot of work going on in the background. They may not necessarily be coming to the board. And I think for say, those projects, we're still very much on track for that. The other thing that we had a look at, again, thinking about the load on all of our stakeholders and what was going on in the environment, was the consultation periods. I think at that point in time, it was fairly late for EER and we left the EER consultation period, but for 600, we did make it a longer consultation period to take account of the environment. At present, we continue to monitor all of the consultation periods. I think the discussion paper that we're going to release next week for fraud and going concern, we had an original shorter period. I think, again, because the environment is still continuing to be one that's a virtual environment, and people have still got other things that are going on. Again, we've decided to extend that into January next year to give people enough time to put together the responses to the discussion paper. I think so. On the we do continue to monitor it. The other thing that we have looked at as well is implementation dates. So obviously 540 has already been implemented, nothing to be done there. 315, the implementation date is coming up next year. We haven't heard too much to date about this implementation date. I think people were adjusting to the environment this year. I have seen a slight shift in people starting to focus a little bit on 315 now, and so we may hear a little bit more about the effective date for 315. But at this point in time, for both 315 and 4400, we're going to leave them. But we do continue to have regular check-ins with our key stakeholders. We have a meeting every couple months with the NSS to see if there's anything new that we need to know. We're also monitoring whether we need to do any additional staff alerts at this point in time. There's a few things bubbling up and we may consider something a little bit later in the year. But for now, I think what we have and the dates that we have, we're leaving, but we are continuing to monitor. Thanks, Jim. I think with that, is there another slide? Sorry, Billy was meant to do this. So I just want to see if there's another slide that we need to talk. Yeah, so we just onto the questions. So Jim, I will hand back to you. Thanks.
Thanks. And do you have any sense in terms of the schedule? Obviously, it depends on the pandemic, but is there a time frame for going back live, or is it wait and see?
At this point in time, our December meeting will go virtual, and then after December, we'll have to wait and see and monitor the environment. I think Tom and others are very committed to going back live. Obviously, we have more time, and they are different in nature when you have the meetings face to face. We will need to have some meetings virtual next year, but at this point in time, I think we're continuing to monitor the environment and obviously the ability to travel. I think the pandemic obviously isn't finished yet, and I think a lot of countries are moving into a second wave, so we're not really sure where it will go at this point in time. So I think we've sort of made decisions to December, and then nothing further than that at this point in time. But we will obviously keep all of you informed as soon as we do make a decision on whether things are going to be live or virtual.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Paul Thompson.
Thanks, James. More really more a statement, which is that you know, I've been particularly impressed with how the board and the staff have managed to, I think the word that's commonly being used is pivot during this difficult time. I think that's to be commended. I think the board and staff have shown their ability to be agile and adapt to the challenging circumstances. With regard to the staff alerts, I think they're particularly useful. I would just encourage, as I did with the IAASB, that the board does work closely with IFAC to ensure that these are widely disseminated in such a way that professional accountancy organisations and NSS all over the world are aware that they exist and that they can be readily and easily translated into their home language.
Thank you, Paul. Dawn?
Thanks, Jim. I just wanted to provide my thanks for the COVID-19 response, particularly with respect to the staff alerts. I think it's just provided excellent content on a very timely basis. It's been high quality and very comprehensive. So my thanks to the board for that. Another quick comment I just wanted to make was my support for the approach on monitoring the implementation dates, and being willing to be flexible so that as you're seeing that the feedback's not being provided on those standards, all this work goes into redeveloping and issuing those changes. And so providing that time and being flexible on the implementation is really important, particularly during these challenging times.
Thank you, Dawn. I'd like to share my appreciation for the alerts as well. I think they were received very well. I'm looking to see if we had, I thought I had a hand up, but then it seems to have disappeared. Not sure if someone's having a connection issue or not. Do we have any final comments on or questions on the work plan or this discussion? Two. Paul? So.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and it was my hand up before, and then I pulled it down because it wasn't COVID-19 related, but your question is a little broader than that. So I would like to commend the Standards Board on really a very comprehensive work plan, and I think it's clear looking at it that there are a lot of elements that could change in the future. We all know that. One of the things I wanted to encourage the staff continues to do over the last couple of months, they've reached out to get representatives for, I think one was a round table on the fraud going concern, and others a technology working group advisory committee. I encourage you to keep doing those because the changes can be quite dynamic, sometimes quite rapid, and I think it helps us as members of the CAG and our organization's member of the CAG to provide timely input on these things instead of waiting for the twice-a-year meetings that come up. So again, good job and keep up the good work.
Thanks, Paul, for that perspective. Kazuhiro?
Thank you. I have a question regarding the schedule about the EER. How about the EER schedule? I heard that this schedule finished next March, first quarter in first quarter 2021. And the ER will be on the agenda at next week's IAASB, but is not at this CAG. Since it is a very important standard, so I think it will be better to have an opportunity to discuss it on CAG before finalizing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazuhiro. Bev, do you have any comments on the timing for EER?
Yeah, I think it was just that the timing between when the responses came in and the posting of the CAG was a little bit short to put it onto this CAG meeting. It definitely, the final version will be for discussion at the March meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I can
maybe just add to that, and sorry, I apologize for everyone. Just as about when I had to start my presentation, my internet just went completely out. So, but I'm back now. So just to reiterate what Bev has said, remember the ER is done with the support of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We have coordinated with them, and the proposed guidance is on the agenda for approval at the March 2021 meeting.
Thank you. Well, at this time, we are going to move into our private closed sessions. There's going to be some shuffling of people moving in or out. And so if we can give the IAASB staff a few moments to do that, we will commence the private session with Galen Hansen will be leading it off, since it is about the CAG chair. And I will turn it over to Galen, and I guess I will step out virtually, and then we'll reconvene and have our private and closed sessions with everyone, with the CAG members.
I have one quick thing, and thank you for the feedback on COVID. And I think Paul made a good, excellent point about making sure that documents are disseminated. I actually am going to ask the members of the CAG for a little help in this, because you're some of the closest followers of our activities. We have a number of platforms by which we circulate information, and LinkedIn, Twitter, among them. If you could follow us and promote it, you have bigger networks than we do, particularly in your local jurisdictions. It would be very helpful for us, because we don't want the documents just to sit there on our website for posterity's sake. And we do it to be helpful. So if you could tap your networks, you would be a huge assistance to us at the IAASB, because we're doing this to be helpful. So small thing to ask, but please do follow us if you have Twitter accounts or LinkedIn. We have our own LinkedIn page now too, where we put everything out, and then your networks will be able to see what we're doing as well.
Thanks, Tom.
Maybe Jim, just before we go, just to note that for the public observers, the YouTube broadcast will also now be terminated, because the rest of the session is only the private session and closed session.
Okay, thank you.
Everybody. And Karen, if you will also just stop the recording as well. Thanks. Okay, Vali, I don't know if you wanted to make some comments, but basically for all our public observers or other observers other than official observers, we will be placing you either on the waiting room, or you may leave the meeting now. For those who are coming back for the closed session, including our